everyone, my name is Vishnu. I'm your host for Muni-Muni Labs. So today I've got something really special for you guys. So today I'm going back to the definition of what this channel was founded upon. Muni-Muni is a verb in Tagalog, which means to think deeply or to ponder. Let me show you guys here. So here you can see Muni-Muni is a Tagalog phrase that means to think deeply and to ponder. And that's what really inspired me to start this channel because I myself, I'm really a thinker. I love to think about things. I love to talk to people. I love to think about things. I love to really ruminate upon stuff that a lot of people often don't even take a second to ruminate more than 2 or 3 seconds upon. And that's why this semester in college, I took an intro to philosophy class because I felt that I would find a lot of like-minded people like myself who would think about such issues as well. And sure, I did. In intro to philosophy class, I absolutely loved my time and I was able to meet with a lot of new friends and I was able to do exactly what my channel says, Muni-Muni, to think deeply, to ponder. So without further ado, I start this new series of simply thinking deeply, of simply pondering. And here I'm sharing an essay that I wrote in my class. And I'm really proud of this essay. I feel like I've been able to say what I want to say and really put it out there. And I would love to see you guys in the comments talk about this and give your opinion about this. Okay, so let me begin. The title of the essay is Existence of Evil Indicates the Absence of God-Imposed Moral Consequences. Theoretical moral arguments have traditionally used the existence of objective moral facts that stem from divine revelation from the heavens as proof for the existence of God. Evans. Moral values are a given, and its consequence an expectation. In this paper, I do not set out to prove that God exists. Instead, I establish my arguments based on Anselm's interpretation of God as something than which nothing greater can be thought. Anselm 432. Anselm's conception is based on power and stance of God, rather than focusing on his role and responsibility to humans. Anselm is more concerned with character and capacity of God, and believes that he can do nothing through weakness, and nothing has power over him. Anselm 434. He believes in characteristics of supreme kindness, infinite knowledge, and eternal existence. Such a stance on God's definition that focuses more on characteristics of God gives me the freedom to evaluate the relationship between God's existence and moral consequence. In this paper, I argue that God does not concern himself with the administration of moral consequences as demonstrated through the prevalence of evil. The need for a social contract to abate evil and bring order to society is an indication that God does not concern himself with the enforcement of moral consequences. This is best supported by Hobbes' social contract perspective. Humans left at their own disposition are inclined to become enemies and endeavor to destroy or subdue one another. Potentially left to continue, humans will naturally resort to a state of war. To prevent such an occurrence, a social contract is developed to help enforce certain basic rights and the compliance of consequences. In essence, the simple existence of a social contract clearly implies that society left alone is evil and flawed. Humans do not have any inherent divine moral consequence to fear or any moral laws to learn. It is only out of necessity for peace and safety that we create such a covenant. God, being the all-knowing and greatest being, cannot be accused of creating a flawed society. Such a thought is unthinkable and incompatible with God's work. God has allowed for the creation of a social contract and the societal enforcement of moral consequences. Thus, God does not involve himself in the creation of enforcement of moral consequences, as he cannot be accused of creating a flawed society or be expected to condemn the creation of a social contract. Critics might argue that societal contract is based upon the natural moral consequences that God has inherently provided to us, a theory commonly attributed to the claim that natural law is an aspect of divine providence, Murphy. Humans have simply been led astray, and a social contract helps to keep us accountable. To this, I argue, why have we been led astray? If such moral consequences are enforced by totally and supremely just, Anselm 434, God, why would he not make this known? Why did such a situation occur in the first place? By claiming that humans have been led astray, the individual questions the faculty of God himself. God is so perfect and so omniscient that he could have made these moral consequences known to humans. He could not have allowed for a situation that led to the development of a social contract. Thus, the argument from the critics fails, and the only explanation is God did not concern himself with the development of moral consequence. This indifferent stance by God on moral consequences becomes clear when we examine how God's mercy and goodness does not allow for the application of moral consequences. The goodness of God is unimaginable for a mortal soul. The amount of mercy and compassion that God has allows him to be kind to even the most evil person. He simply cannot just give good things to people who are good and punish those who are evil. This presents itself as a paradox to his infinite mercy. This is a mystery to which even Anselm wonders, why he who is supremely just could have willed such a thing. The solution to the dilemma lies in the perspective from which Anselm and his contemporaries were viewing the paradox. It is true that God possesses an inconceivable amount of mercy and compassion that forces him to treat all equally and give good even to the evil. If moral consequences do exist, then God should justly punish the evil. Yet God does not punish the evil and can sometimes be found rewarding them. Since God is perfect and the greatest being, the only explanation is that God does not administer such justice. Even Anselm agrees that one must nonetheless believe that its mercy is in no way opposed to justice. The only way to make sense of such a paradoxical arrangement is to separate moral consequence from God himself. Others might respond by rationalizing God's actions to the wicked. They might argue that God gives good to the wicked in hopes of their redemption, in anticipation that by seeing the fruits of being good, that the evil might reconsider their wicked ways. However, such a rationalization poses a threat to God's definition. The critics must consider, why does God give such second chances and good deeds to certain evil people and not to others? Why is there such an inconsistency in God's treatment of the wicked? By posing such rationalization, the critics have questioned the God's ability to remain consistent. Since God is infinitely knowledgeable, he simply cannot be inconsistent in his activities and treatment. It goes against the fundamental nature of God. Thus, the above counter-arguments presented by the critics fails. Since this is not possible, it must be realized that God does not involve himself in the administration of moral consequences, as he is kind beyond infinite measure. Finally, it is the epistemological objection to the divine command theory that helps further solidify the argument that God-imposed moral consequences could not reasonably exist unless we assume that everyone is evil, which is fortunately not the case. I will be using certain elements of the epistemological objection to the DCT divine command theory and adding my own interpretation to its relevance to the problem of evil in my discussion. Proponents of this theory argue that non-believers in the moral fabric of the universe cannot reasonably be expected to know that God has commanded, and therefore cannot be morally bound to follow the commands of God. Without proper knowledge, one cannot reasonably be expected to uphold and follow such moral laws. Such a difference in knowledge produces a discrepancy that cannot be attributed to the greatness of God. Thus, one is forced to reject the DCT and consequently the existence of moral consequences. I'd like to extend this argument further to the problem of evil. The reasonable non-believers that do not have such access to God's command is not just limited to a single group of people. I propose that R&Bs are the entirety of humanity, as we simply cannot have access to all the information that God possesses. God's access to information is infinite and ours is finite. Thus all of humanity is relegated to the positions of R&Bs. Since this designation has been established, we can further infer that if the DCT holds true, then we can all be considered evil. Since we do not know the entirety of divine knowledge, then we cannot know if we have sinned or not. Every single action that we take could be evil, since we are not privy to the knowledge that differentiates these actions. Thus, our lack of knowledge on DCT leads to our classification of being evil. This, however, goes against the work of God. Since God is supreme, being filled with goodness, he could not have produced an evil being. Such a thought is unfathomable. There could be no connection between God and evil. Thus, the only way to reconcile such a difference is by accepting the separation of moral consequences and the existence of God. Critics might argue that the limited divine knowledge that we possess is enough to allow us to avoid evil. Moral consequences given by God, albeit limited to our mortal understanding, is enough for us to differentiate a path of evil and good. To this I respond, Is it adequate for a bridge engineer to only understand 50% of the architecture needed to build a structure? Will this 50% knowledge allow him to contribute to his society in any beneficial way? The answer is a clear no. The bridge engineer goes through rigorous training in structural engineering and obtains an undergraduate degree to ensure mastery of his work. He must understand and account for every single screw and piece of metal that will be used. He must account for its foundation as well as its resistance to unforeseen events. Similarly, humans must have 100% knowledge of the nature of moral consequences and divine commands to be able to ensure that they have not sinned. Without complete knowledge, they have the potential to have committed an evil act and contribute to the harm of society. Thus, a lack of knowledge leads to the eventual designation of being evil, further solidifying my argument that the existence of God does not have important moral consequences because God and evil cannot exist. In conclusion, I have argued that the existence of God does not have important moral consequences through the demonstration of the existence of evil. The formation of social contracts indicates that moral consequences could not have stemmed from God. Furthermore, God's indifferent stance on moral consequences is explained by his infinite kindness and mercy. Finally, the fragility of the argument that moral consequences are imposed by God is exposed by the wrongful assumption that the entirety of humanity is evil. And here are my works cited. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for staying throughout the whole video to look into to read the whole essay. And I would like to, before finishing off, I would like to say that this is an entirely objective piece for philosophy. We talk about a lot of topics varying from God to other kinds of topics that could be considered controversial. But for me, I do not intend to harm anyone in terms of my stance on how I looked in God. This is simply a stance that I took, and I wanted to argue and defend upon it. And I don't intend to harm or challenge the beliefs of others. Thank you so much. See you guys next time.